When a research drone found a truck sitting upright 70 meters below a frozen Canadian lake in 2016, the driver inside had been missing for 25 years. Jozef Novak hadn't gone through the ice by accident. He was murdered for documenting illegal Cold War waste dumping that poisoned the waters he crossed every winter. The research drone descended through the black water of Great Slave Lake like a mechanical ghost, its lights piercing darkness that had existed undisturbed for decades. Dr. B. Dast. Sarah Chen watched the monitors from the research vessel above, documenting lake depth changes for a climate study in March of 2016. The sonar readings had shown an anomaly at 70 meters, something large and geometric that did not belong in the natural topography of the lake bottom. The drone's camera resolved the shape slowly as it approached, metal emerging from the murk, angular and unmistakably human-made. Sarah leaned closer to the screen, her breath catching as recognition formed. It was a truck, a large cargo hauler sitting upright on the lake floor as if parked there deliberately. The cab was intact, windows dark, the entire vehicle covered in a thin layer of sediment that gave it a ghostly appearance in the drone's harsh lighting. She maneuvered the drone closer, circling the truck to document it from all angles. The cargo bed was empty, whatever it had carried either lost or never loaded. The tires were still inflated, preserved by the cold water and lack of oxygen at this depth. Most disturbing was the driver's side window, where the drone's light revealed a shape inside the cab, a figure slumped against the seatbelt, frozen in position for however long the truck had been down here. Sarah checked the license plate, zooming the camera to capture the numbers clearly. She would need to report this to authorities immediately, but protocol required thorough documentation first. The truck showed no obvious damage, no signs of fend, the violent impact one would expect from plunging through ice. It looked like someone had simply driven it into the lake and parked it on the bottom, an impossibility that made no sense but matched what her cameras were showing. The research team spent 2 more hours documenting the site, taking measurements and recording video from multiple angles. When they finally surfaced and made contact with shore, Sarah called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Detachment in Yellowknife. The desk sergeant took her report with professional calm, asked for coordinates, and said someone would contact her shortly. Within an hour, her phone rang with a senior investigator asking detailed questions about what exactly she had found. The license plate came back registered to a truck owned by Jozef Novak, last seen in March of 1991. Missing person case never solved, presumed dead after disappearing while driving the ice road across Great Slave Lake. The investigator's voice carried the weight of a 25-year-old mystery suddenly resurfacing, literally, from the depths. They would need to send divers down, recover the vehicle and remains, try to understand what had happened to a man who vanished on a frozen lake and ended up 70 meters below the surface, preserved by cold water and time. Jozef Novak was 58 years old in March of 1991, though most people who knew him said he looked older, weathered by decades of hard living and harder memories. He had been driving the ice roads of Canada's Northwest Territories for 18 years, long enough to become a legend among the tight community of truckers who made their living on frozen lakes that existed only 4 months each year. His reputation was built on reliability and nerve, qualities he had developed long before he ever saw the Canadian North. He had been born in Prague in 1933, growing up during the Nazi occupation and coming of age in the communist regime that followed. He studied mechanical engineering at Charles University, married his sweetheart Vera in '57, and worked as a civil engineer designing bridges and roads for the Czechoslovak state. His life was ordinary, in the way lives were ordinary, behind the Iron Curtain, restricted but stable, limited but predictable. The Prague Spring of 1968 changed everything. Jozef participated in the brief flowering of freedom, joined demonstrations calling for reform, believed for a few months that communism might evolve into something livable. Then Soviet tanks rolled into the city on August 21st, crushing the reform movement and reimposing total control. Jozef watched soldiers barely younger than his daughter pointing rifles at crowds, saw friends arrested and disappeared, and understood that staying meant accepting permanent oppression. He and Vera fled in November of '68, taking their 10-year-old daughter Anna and escaping through Austria with forged travel documents. They spent 3 years in refugee camps in Austria and Germany, waiting for a country to accept them. Canada approved their application in '71, and they arrived in Toronto with 2 suitcases and minimal English, starting over at ages 38 and 36 in a country whose language and customs were completely foreign. Vera never adapted well to immigration, the loss of her family and language and identity too much to overcome. She worked factory jobs and cleaned houses, sent money to relatives still in Czechoslovakia, and died of cancer in '83 at age 48, worn down by exile and grief. Anna went to university, became a teacher, moved through Canadian life with the ease of someone young enough to fully transform. Joseph found himself alone in his 50s, his wife dead, his daughter building a life that had no space for a Czech engineer who spoke English with a heavy accent. He moved north in '84, drawn by work that did not require perfect language or Canadian credentials. The ice road companies needed drivers who were competent and fearless, men willing to haul loads across frozen lakes where the only thing between them and drowning was ice that might be solid or might break without warning. Joseph learned the trade quickly, discovered that he was good at calculating ice thickness and reading weather, that the isolation and danger suited something in his personality. The frozen north became home in a way Toronto never had, vast and empty and demanding nothing except competence and courage. Joseph filed his route plan at the Yellowknife Depot on the morning of March 15, 1991, preparing for what should have been his final run of the season. The winter had been long and profitable, dozens of successful crossings hauling supplies to mining operations scattered across the territory. His truck, a Kenworth heavy hauler he maintained with obsessive care, was loaded with drilling equipment destined for a diamond exploration site 200 kilometers north of Yellowknife, accessible only by ice road across Great Slave Lake. The ice road operations manager reviewed Joseph's paperwork and weather reports, checking ice thickness readings that had been updated that morning. The readings showed adequate thickness along the established route, 40 centimeters of solid ice over the main crossing points, enough to support trucks weighing up to 30 tons. Joseph's load was 22 tons, well within safety margins. The manager signed off on the route, reminding Joseph that this would likely be the last week of operations. Spring thaw was beginning, and the road would close soon. Joseph performed his pre-trip inspection with the thoroughness that had kept him alive for 18 seasons. Tires, brakes, steering, all functioning perfectly. The load was properly secured, weight distributed according to specifications. He carried emergency equipment required for ice road, driving, survival, suit, ice picks, rope, flares, and a satellite phone for emergencies. The phone was new that year, expensive but mandatory, a safety improvement that companies hoped would prevent deaths from trucks going through ice in remote areas. He left Yellowknife at 0800 hours, the sun already well above the horizon, in the lengthening days of mid-March. The temperature was -5 Celsius, cold enough to maintain ice integrity, but warm enough to signal that spring was approaching. Other truckers were on the road that morning, a small convoy spaced far enough apart to avoid stressing the ice with concentrated weight. Joseph drove with his usual caution, maintaining steady speed, avoiding sudden acceleration or braking that might create dangerous vibrations. The ice road crossed Great Slave Lake at its narrowest point, following a route that had been used for decades, marked with reflective posts and monitored by spotters who watched for signs of weakness. Joseph passed two other trucks heading south, drivers acknowledging each other with brief radio calls. At the midpoint of the lake crossing, approximately 100 kilometers from Yellowknife, another southbound driver noted Joseph's position and reported it to dispatch as routine traffic update. That was the last confirmed sighting. Joseph should have reached the northern shore within 2 hours, then continued on to the exploration site via land roads. When he failed to arrive by noon, the site manager called dispatch, asking about the delay. Dispatch tried the satellite phone repeatedly, getting no response. By 1400 hours, search and rescue was notified, and trucks were sent back across the ice road looking for signs of Joseph or his Kenworth. They found nothing, no tracks leaving the established route, no breaks in the ice, no indication that anything had gone wrong. Joseph Novak had simply vanished. The search for Joseph began in earnest on March 16, with crews scanning the ice road for any evidence of what might have happened. The RCMP coordinated with ice road operators, sending teams to examine every meter of the route Joseph should have traveled. They found tire tracks matching his truck's distinctive tread pattern, following the marked road across the lake, but the tracks ended abruptly at a point roughly 120 kilometers north of Yellowknife, approximately 20 kilometers past his last confirmed sighting. The ice around where the tracks ended showed no obvious weakness or break. Investigators drilled test holes, measuring ice thickness at 42 centimeters, more than adequate to support Joseph's truck. There were no cracks radiating from the area, no depression indicating ice failure, no water on the surface suggesting recent breakthrough. It was as if the truck had simply lifted off the ice and disappeared into the air, an impossibility that left searchers baffled and frustrated. Aircraft equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the lake, searching for heat signatures that might indicate a truck partially submerged or a survivor in the water. They found nothing. Divers were brought in to check the lake bottom in the area where tracks ended, but Great Slave Lake is one of the deepest lakes in North America, reaching depths over 600 meters in some areas. The divers could search only shallow zones near shore, and found no sign of Joseph's truck in accessible depths. As March turned to April and temperatures rose, the ice road closed for the season. Search coordinators expected that spring thaw would reveal Joseph's location. Trucks that went through ice often surfaced when the ice melted completely, floating for a time before sinking again. Teams watched the lake through April and May as the ice broke up and drifted away. No truck appeared, no oil slick, no debris, nothing to indicate where Joseph and his Kenworth had gone. The official investigation concluded in June of '91, with a finding of accidental death, cause unknown. The most likely explanation was that Joseph had driven over a weak spot in the ice, possibly caused by underwater currents that prevented normal ice formation, and the truck had punched through and sank immediately. The lack of surface evidence was attributed to the ice closing over the hole, freezing solid again in the hours before search crews arrived. It was an imperfect explanation but the only one that fit available facts. Joseph's daughter Anna traveled from Toronto to Yellowknife in May, meeting with investigators and learning that her father's body would probably never be recovered. Great Slave Lake was too deep, too cold, too vast. She arranged a memorial service attended by other ice road drivers who spoke respectfully of Joseph's skill and courage. His truck and cargo were written off as complete loss. His apartment was cleared, his few possessions distributed or discarded. Anna returned to Toronto, carrying a small box of photographs and documents, everything that remained of her father's life. Josef Novak was added to the memorial listing ice road truckers who had died on the job, one more name among dozens who had been claimed by the frozen north. Joseph's journey to the ice roads had begun 40 years earlier, in a city under occupation, though understanding his death required knowing how he lived. Prague in 1945 was a child's nightmare, the final days of Nazi control marked by desperate violence and random executions. Joseph was 12 when the war ended, old enough to remember soldiers in the streets and his mother hiding bread in the cellar, old enough to understand that the Russian soldiers who liberated the city were not exactly liberators. The communist regime that followed shaped Joseph's youth and young adulthood. He learned to keep opinions private, to navigate bureaucracy through patience and careful relationship building, to separate his public life from his private thoughts. He excelled in mathematics and engineering, subjects considered politically safe because they served the state's industrialization goals. His professors recognized talent but warned him against standing out too much. Excellence could attract unwanted attention from authorities. He met Vera at a state-sponsored youth gathering in '56, recognized in her eyes the same careful navigation of the system he practiced himself. Their courtship was conducted in whispers and coded language, discussing dreams of travel and freedom only in private moments. They married with the state's approval, Joseph's engineering credentials and political reliability making him an acceptable match. Anna was born in '58, and Joseph spent the next decade building bridges and raising his daughter, telling himself that limited freedom was better than none. The Prague Spring shattered this compromise. For 6 months in '68, Czechoslovakia experimented with socialism with a human face, relaxing censorship and allowing genuine political discussion. Joseph attended protests and meetings, spoke openly for the first time in his adult life, believed that transformation was possible. The Soviet invasion crushed not just the reforms but Joseph's ability to continue living in the system that had controlled him since childhood. Fleeing was desperate and dangerous. Joseph used his engineering connections to obtain forged travel permits, claimed he needed to attend a conference in Austria, and simply never returned. Vera and Anna followed separately, reducing suspicion. They met in Vienna at a refugee center, knowing they could never go home again, that families left behind would face interrogation and possible punishment, that everything familiar was lost forever. The 3 years in refugee camps were meant to process trauma and prepare immigrants for new lives, but mostly, they were bureaucratic purgatory. Joseph's engineering degree was not recognized, his work experience irrelevant in Western job markets. He was nearly 40 when they reached Canada, too old to start over but with no choice except to try. Toronto offered immigrant services and language classes, but could not offer belonging or purpose. Vera's death in '83 destroyed the family they had tried to rebuild. Anna had her teaching career and Canadian friends, moving forward in ways Joseph could not. He felt himself becoming irrelevant, a refugee whose suffering was historical curiosity rather than current reality. The North offered escape from this, work that required only skill and courage, isolation that matched his internal state. The ice roads gave him 20 more years, and in those years, he was finally free. The search for Joseph consumed resources and attention through the spring and summer of 1991, but by autumn the case was effectively closed. The RCMP maintained an open file because no body had been recovered, but investigators moved on to cases where evidence actually existed. Joseph was officially listed as missing, presumed dead, his disappearance catalogued as one more tragedy on roads that killed several truckers every winter through accidents and ice failures. Anna pursued answers with the determination of someone who had lost too much already. She hired a private investigator in Yellowknife to review the case, hoping professional eyes might find something police had missed. The investigator spent 3 weeks re-interviewing witnesses, examining ice road records, and reviewing search reports. His conclusion was the same as the official finding. Joseph had gone through the ice in a location where the lake was too deep for recovery, and the truck remained on the bottom, somewhere in an area covering hundreds of square kilometers. The financial aftermath was complicated by the lack of a body. Joseph's life insurance policy required proof of death, which could not be provided without remains. Anna began the legal process of having her father declared dead in absentia, necessary to settle his estate and close his affairs. The process took 2 years, requiring evidence that every reasonable effort to locate him had failed. In '93, a judge signed the death certificate, and Joseph Novak was officially deceased as of March 15, '91. His estate was minimal. The truck had been leased and was written off by the company. His apartment contained little of value, furniture, and personal items that sold for perhaps $2,000. A small savings account, life insurance that finally paid out, and pension funds totaled $38,000. Anna used the money to pay off her student loans and tried to move on with her life, knowing her father was gone but unable to grieve properly without closure. The Ice Road community remembered Joseph in their own way. His photograph was added to the memorial wall at the Yellowknife Depot, among dozens of other drivers who had died on the job. Older truckers told stories about the Czech, who drove like he was fleeing demons, fast but never reckless, fearless but never stupid. New drivers heard his name mentioned as example of how even the best could be claimed by the ice, how experience and skill could not guarantee survival when you were driving on a surface that might collapse without warning. By 2000, Joseph was mostly forgotten by everyone except Anna. She married, had children, built a life in Toronto that had nothing to do with the frozen north or ice roads, or the father who had left Prague to give her freedom. She thought about him sometimes, wondered if he had suffered in those final moments, or if the cold water had taken him quickly. She told her children about their grandfather who had escaped communism and died in a frozen lake, reducing his life to a story that sounded almost fictional. 25 years passed, and Joseph remained at the bottom of Great Slave Lake, unknown and undiscovered, his truck a time capsule, waiting in darkness for technology to advance enough to find what the lake had hidden so well. The years between Joseph's disappearance and discovery passed with the indifference of time that notices neither individual tragedies nor collective memory. The Ice Road continued operating every winter, new drivers replacing those who retired or died, the same risks accepted because the pay was good and some men needed the danger. Several more truckers were lost during those 25 years, trucks going through ice or drivers dying in accidents, each death adding another name to the memorial wall that Joseph's photograph watched over. Anna's life moved forward in the way lives do, when grief is unresolved, but unavoidable. She married David in '94, a high school history teacher who understood about complicated fathers and historical trauma. They had 2 children, Sophie in '96 and Michael in '98, and Anna found herself trying to explain to them who their grandfather had been, why he had lived the way he did, what his death meant. The explanations always felt inadequate, reducing complex history to simple narratives that children could process. She visited Yellowknife once more in 2005, bringing David and the children to see where Joseph had lived and worked. The depot manager gave them a tour, showed them Joseph's photograph on the memorial wall, explained Ice Road operations with the careful respect accorded to the families of the dead. They drove out to the edge of Great Slave Lake, stood looking at the vast frozen surface, and tried to imagine what it meant to drive across water covered only by ice. The children were impressed but could not really understand, could not connect this frozen wasteland to the grandfather they never met. The Ice Road itself evolved with technology and regulation. GPS tracking became mandatory, allowing dispatch to monitor truck locations in real time. Ice thickness sensors were deployed across the routes, providing continuous data about structural integrity. Survival equipment requirements were expanded, including emergency beacons and improved satellite communications. Each safety improvement was a response to deaths that might have been prevented, lessons learned at the cost of lives like Joseph's. The mining industry that sustained the ice roads grew dramatically through the 2000s. Diamond discoveries in the Northwest Territories created boom conditions, more trucks hauling more cargo across more ice roads, the economic imperative overriding caution whenever possible. Environmental groups raised concerns about the impact of heavy trucks on lake ecosystems, about the accidents that leaked fuel and cargo into pristine waters. The debates continued without resolution. Economics and safety balanced precariously like trucks on ice. In 2010, Anna's mother Vera would have been 75 if cancer had not taken her in '83. Anna thought about this sometimes, wondered if her parents had found whatever peace exists after death, if they were together again in some way that made the suffering of their lives worthwhile. She did not believe in such things exactly, but the thought provided comfort that facts could not. By 2015, Joseph had been gone longer than he had been part of Anna's adult life. She was 54, teaching at the same Toronto high school where David worked, living a life that was stable and comfortable, and utterly removed from frozen lakes and vanished fathers. She thought about him less frequently as years passed, his memory becoming history rather than grief. She could not have imagined that within months, everything would change, that the lake would finally release its secrets. The dive operation began in early April of 2016, delayed by logistics and weather until conditions allowed safe deep water recovery. The team assembled in Yellowknife included specialists from across Canada, technical divers experienced with deep cold water operations, equipment operators, and RCMP investigators. The operation cost was substantial, funded partially by the territorial government and partially by media organizations paying for exclusive access to the story. Lead diver Marcus Webb had descended to 70 meters before, though never in water as cold as Great Slave Lake. The temperature at depth was barely above freezing, cold enough to kill an unprotected diver in minutes. The dive suits were sophisticated systems of heating elements and insulation, limiting bottom time to 30 minutes before safety required ascent. The lake's depth meant decompression stops on the way up, turning a 30-minute working dive into a 3-hour operation. The first descent was exploratory, confirming what the drone had found and assessing recovery options. Marcus descended through darkness, lit only by his powerful lights, following the guide rope to the coordinates where Joseph's truck waited. The visibility was poor, sediment and organic material suspended in the water, creating a murky curtain that his lights barely penetrated. At 65 meters, the truck's shape emerged from the gloom, and Marcus felt the uncanny sensation of seeing something that should not exist at this depth. The truck sat perfectly upright on the lake bottom, as if parked there deliberately rather than having plunged through ice. The tires were still inflated, the structure intact, no obvious damage visible. Marcus circled it slowly, filming everything, noting details that would inform the recovery plan. The cargo bed was empty, whatever Joseph had been hauling either never loaded or lost during the descent. The driver's side door was closed, window intact, the cab dark and silent. Marcus approached the window carefully, shining his light through the glass. Joseph's body was still there, held upright by the seatbelt, preserved by the cold water and lack of oxygen. Decomposition had been arrested by the freezing temperature, leaving the body in a state that forensic teams described as remarkable preservation. The image was disturbing in its clarity, a man who had been dead for 25 years looking like he might have died days ago. Inside the cab, Marcus could see papers scattered across the passenger seat, a jacket draped over the steering wheel, and most interesting, a hard-sided case secured to the floor with what looked like chains. The case was marked with reflective tape, deliberately visible, suggesting it contained something Joseph considered important. Marcus documented everything on video, knowing that recovery would require multiple dives and careful planning. The second dive, 2 days later, involved attaching lift bags and securing cables for extraction. The truck would need to be raised slowly, decompressing gradually to prevent structural damage from pressure changes. Marcus worked methodically, threading cables through the chassis, inflating bags that would provide initial lift. The process was complicated by the cold and limited bottom time, each task requiring coordination that was difficult in the murky water. On the third dive, recovery began. The truck rose slowly from the lake bottom, suspended by cables from a barge above, ascending at a rate calculated to prevent damage. Marcus ascended with it, monitoring the lift. After 4 hours, the truck broke the surface, water streaming from every opening, and was carefully loaded onto the recovery barge. Joseph Novak's final resting place had finally been found. The forensic examination began immediately after the truck was secured, in a climate-controlled facility in Yellowknife. Investigators worked carefully, documenting every detail before touching anything, treating the cab as both crime scene and archaeological site. Yosef's body was removed first, handled with the respect owed to the dead, transported to the coroner's office for examination that would attempt to determine cause of death after 25 years. The hard-sided case that Marcus had noticed was removed next, its chains cut carefully, the seals intact despite decades underwater. The case was a Pelican brand waterproof container, designed for protecting sensitive equipment in extreme conditions. It had done its job perfectly, the interior completely dry when investigators opened it under controlled conditions. Inside lay documents, photographs, a journal, and several rolls of film still in their protective canisters. The journal was Yosef's, his handwriting confirmed by comparison to known samples. The entries dated back to 1987, 4 years before his disappearance, and documented observations from his years driving the ice roads. The early entries were mundane, notes about weather and ice conditions and equipment maintenance. But starting in '88, the entries shifted, becoming detailed records of something Joseph had witnessed during his nighttime runs across the frozen lakes. He had seen trucks that were not part of official ice road operations, heavy vehicles traveling without lights late at night, avoiding the marked routes and normal checkpoints. He had observed them from a distance, curious about who would risk the ice roads off the established safe paths. In the winter of '88 to '89, he followed one of these trucks, maintaining a safe distance, watching as it stopped in the middle of Great Slave Lake and unloaded cargo through holes cut in the ice. The journal described what Joseph photographed on subsequent nights, using a camera with telephoto lens that he had purchased for exactly this purpose. The trucks were disposing of something into the lake, metal containers marked with radiation symbols and military designations. Joseph documented dates, times, locations, photographing the trucks and their cargo, recording license plates and company names. The operation was systematic and regular, occurring every few weeks throughout the winter months when the ice was thick enough to support heavy vehicles. The photographs, once developed by the forensic team, confirmed everything Joseph had written. Images of trucks marked with corporate logos, containers being pushed through ice holes, men in protective suits supervising operations. The most damning photographs showed documents visible in telephoto shots, manifests listing radioactive materials and chemical weapons components being disposed of through a contract between a private waste management company and government agencies. Josef's final journal entries, dated March of '91, revealed his plan. He had accumulated 4 years of evidence documenting illegal dumping of hazardous materials into Great Slave Lake. He was going to deliver this evidence to journalists in Yellowknife who could expose the operation. His final run was not just another cargo delivery, but a mission to reveal crimes that had been committed in the frozen north, where nobody watched and few people cared. He knew there was risk, had written about feeling watched during his last few trips, about trucks following him that he could not identify. His final entry, dated March 14, '91, expressed hope that someone would find this case if anything happened to him. The investigation that followed the discovery of Joseph's evidence expanded rapidly, involving federal agencies, environmental specialists, and prosecutors who specialized in Cold War-era crimes. The waste management company Joseph had photographed, Arctic Environmental Services, had gone bankrupt in '96. Its records supposedly destroyed in a warehouse fire that investigators now viewed with suspicion. But corporate filings and financial records revealed connections to larger companies still operating, and to government contracts that had been classified until recently. The dumping operation had begun in the mid-'80s, taking advantage of the remote location and limited oversight of ice road operations. Hazardous materials from decommissioned military bases, failed weapon prototypes, and contaminated equipment from nuclear facilities were transported north and disposed of through holes in lake ice. The operation was cheaper than proper disposal methods and conveniently erased evidence of programs that governments wanted to forget. By Josef's estimates, documented in his journal, thousands of containers had been dumped into Great Slave Lake over 6 years. The key breakthrough came from financial records, showing that Arctic Environmental Services had paid a security consultant named Robert Marsh $20,000 in March of '91, listed as Route Security Services. Marsh was a former military intelligence officer who had transitioned to private security work, specializing in problems that required discretion and deniability. He was 73 in 2016, living in British Columbia, and when RCMP investigators appeared at his door with questions about Joseph Novak, he understood immediately that the past had finally caught up. Marsh, offered immunity in exchange for testimony, described the operation with clinical detachment. Arctic Environmental Services had learned that a ice road trucker was photographing their disposal operations, had traced the photography back to Joseph through contacts within the trucking companies. Marsh was contracted to eliminate the problem permanently and make it look like an accident. The plan was simple and effective: sabotage Joseph's truck to fail on the ice road, ensuring his death appeared to be another tragic ice road casualty. The sabotage was sophisticated. Marsh had accessed Joseph's truck at the Yellowknife Depot on the night of March 14, using stolen security credentials. He installed a remote-controlled device on the truck's steering mechanism, allowing him to disable steering from a distance using radio control. The device was small, easily overlooked during routine inspection, designed to activate once and then destroy itself. On March 15, Marsh followed Joseph across the ice road, using a snowmobile, maintaining visual contact from a distance. At the predetermined location, where the lake was known to be over 70 meters deep, Marsh activated the device. Joseph's steering failed catastrophically, the truck veering off the marked route toward an area where the ice was thinner due to underwater currents. The truck broke through, plunged into the lake, and sank rapidly. Marsh waited long enough to confirm no survival was possible, then returned to shore and reported successful completion to his employers. The device's self-destruct mechanism left no evidence, and Joseph's disappearance was attributed to ice failure and driver error. What Marsh and his employers had not anticipated was that Joseph would secure his evidence in a waterproof case, that he would chain it in place with the hope someone might eventually find it, and that technology would advance enough to make recovery possible 25 years later. The legal proceedings began in autumn of 2016, complicated by the time elapsed and the difficulty of prosecuting crimes committed 25 years earlier. Marsh's testimony provided the foundation for murder charges, but the conspiracy extended far beyond one security consultant. Investigators traced the web of companies and individuals involved in the illegal dumping operation, finding connections that reached into government agencies and corporate boardrooms across Canada. 3 executives from companies connected to Arctic Environmental Services were charged with conspiracy to commit murder and environmental crimes. 2 were in their 70s, 1 had died in 2012. The surviving defendants argued that they had not directly ordered Joseph's death, had only hired Marsh to provide security, and were unaware of his methods. Their defense was that Marsh had acted independently, exceeding his authority. Prosecutors presented financial records and email evidence showing the executives knew exactly what security services meant in this context. The environmental crimes were easier to prove and harder to defend. Divers sent to the locations Joseph had documented found containers exactly where his photographs and journal indicated they would be. The containers were degraded after 3 decades underwater, many leaking their contents into the lake. Testing revealed radioactive materials, chemical weapons components, and industrial toxins at levels that posed serious risk to the ecosystem and to communities that depended on the lake for water and fish. The cleanup operation began in 2017, a massive undertaking requiring specialized equipment and costing over $200 million. Remotely operated vehicles located and recovered containers from depths up to 100 meters. The materials were transported to proper disposal facilities, though environmental scientists acknowledged that decades of leakage had already contaminated significant portions of the lake. The full restoration would take generations and might never be complete. Public reaction was fierce, particularly in the Northwest Territories where communities felt betrayed by southern governments and corporations that had treated their land as a dumping ground. Indigenous leaders pointed out that their concerns about lake contamination had been dismissed for decades, that Joseph's evidence confirmed what traditional knowledge had suggested. The scandal forced policy changes regarding oversight of remote industrial operations and disposal of hazardous materials. The criminal trials concluded in 2018 with mixed results. Marsh received a 12-year sentence for second-degree murder, his testimony and cooperation reducing what might have been a harsher sentence. One executive was convicted of conspiracy charges and sentenced to 8 years. The others were acquitted when juries could not be convinced beyond reasonable doubt that they had knowingly ordered Joseph's murder rather than merely hired security services. The civil lawsuits were more successful. Families and communities affected by the contamination received settlements totaling over $500 million from companies connected to the dumping operation. Anna was included in these settlements as Joseph's heir, receiving $3 million that felt like blood money, compensation for a father's murder that no amount could make right. She donated most of it to environmental causes and indigenous rights organizations, keeping only enough to establish a scholarship fund in Joseph's name. Justice, such as it was, remained incomplete. Most people responsible were dead or too elderly for meaningful punishment. The environmental damage could not be undone. But the truth was finally known, and Joseph's sacrifice had achieved exactly what he intended. Anna traveled to Yellowknife in June of 2018 to attend the dedication ceremony for a memorial honoring her father. She was 57 years old, accompanied by her husband David and their adult children, 3 generations of a family that began when Joseph and Vera fled Prague 50 years earlier. Standing in the summer warmth beside Great Slave Lake, she tried to process the revelations of the past 2 years, to reconcile the distant father she remembered with the hero he had become in death. The memorial was a simple stone marker placed at the edge of the lake, overlooking the water that had hidden Joseph's truck for 25 years. The inscription read, Joseph Novak, 1933 to 1991, ice road trucker, immigrant, protector of the land he loved. Beneath this, a longer text explained how Joseph had documented environmental crimes and died trying to expose them, how his evidence had eventually forced cleanup and accountability. Other ice road drivers attended the ceremony, older men who remembered Joseph, younger ones who knew him only as legend. Joseph's truck was preserved and placed in the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre in Yellowknife, part of an exhibit about the ice roads and the people who drove them. The exhibit included his journal, selections from his photographs, and explanation of what he had discovered and why it mattered. Visitors read about a Czech refugee who had fled Soviet oppression only to find different corruption in his adopted home, who had spent his final years documenting crimes because his conscience would not allow silence. The journals were published in full in 2019, edited by historians who provided context about Cold War disposal practices and environmental regulation. The book became unexpectedly popular, Joseph's voice coming through clearly in the careful documentation and growing outrage at what he was witnessing. Readers responded to the narrative of an ordinary man doing extraordinary things, risking everything because someone had to bear witness. Anna gave interviews occasionally, describing the father she had barely known, admitting that his emotional distance now made sense in ways it never had during his life. He had been carrying the trauma of Prague and the war, the loss of his homeland and wife, and finally the knowledge of crimes he could not ignore. The ice roads had been both escape and purpose, isolation that protected him from connections that might have demanded he stop investigating, might have convinced him to look away for the sake of safety. Sophie and Michael, Joseph's grandchildren who never met him, found themselves connected to history in ways they had not expected. They had inherited not just Czech ancestry, but a legacy of resistance and sacrifice, a grandfather who had stood against power twice in his life, first fleeing communism, and then exposing corruption in the country that had given him refuge. They carried his story forward, teaching their own children about the man who drove ice roads and fought for truth. The ice roads continued operating each winter, drivers still risking their lives hauling cargo across frozen lakes. But environmental monitoring was stricter now, oversight more rigorous, the lessons learned from Joseph's evidence forcing accountability that might prevent future crimes. The lake itself remained scarred by decades of illegal dumping, but cleanup continued, slowly healing damage that should never have been inflicted. Joseph Novak had made his final delivery after all, 25 years late but arriving exactly when needed. The evidence he died protecting had traveled from the lake bottom to courtrooms and headlines, forcing truth into light where it could not be ignored. The ice road trucker, who fled one frozen wasteland and died in another, had finally completed his journey, his story no longer vanished but preserved like his truck had been, waiting to be discovered by those who came after.